Muy bien, muy buenas tardes para todas las personas que están hoy conectadas en este inicio del segundo coloquio sobre intersubjetividad y segunda persona para la Facultad de Filosofía de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Es una alegría y un honor poder hoy tener invitados, invitadas tan especiales e importantes a propósito de un debate que nos ha interesado mucho en la Facultad de Filosofía, que tiene que ver con la perspectiva de segunda persona, tanto en lo relacionado con la atribución mental como en lo ligado a debates sobre responsabilidad ética. Mi nombre es Alejandro Mantilla, yo soy estudiante de doctorado de la Facultad de Filosofía de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Voy a contarles muy rápidamente cuál es el propósito de la sesión de hoy. Hoy abrimos entonces con esta conversación con el profesor Stephen Darwall un primer momento de conversación de un coloquio sobre intersubjetividad y segunda persona que tendrá esta conversación en formato remoto, pero que durante los días miércoles y jueves tendremos una conversación ya en formato presencial en el Auditorio Marino Troncoso del edificio Fernando Barón de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Repito, el edificio Fernando Barón, Auditorio Marino Troncoso. Vamos a contar con varias ponencias sobre diversos temas ligados a la intersubjetividad, a la atribución mental, a la segunda persona y también a debates sobre responsabilidad ética. En este coloquio nos va a acompañar también la profesora Patricia Brunstein. Ella viene de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba en Argentina, quien nos va a compartir una ponencia sobre empatía, emociones vicarias. Eso vamos a tenerlo el día de mañana a las 4 de la tarde. Entonces les invitamos también a que puedan acompañarnos, no solo en esta conversación con el profesor Darwall, también a que nos puedan acompañar en el coloquio y especialmente en la conversación con la profesora Patricia Brunstein mañana a las 4 de la tarde. Para quienes están conectando, contarles también que esta conversación está siendo grabada y transmitida por las redes sociales de nuestra facultad, aprovechando pues la magnitud y la importancia de este evento. Yo quiero entonces presentar al profesor Stephen Darwall. El profesor Stephen Darwall es alguien muy reconocido por su trabajo en ética, sobre deontología, sobre variados enfoques kantianos acerca de la responsabilidad. El profesor Darwall es Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy en la Universidad de Yale. Tiene varias publicaciones cruciales. Quiero destacar Morality, Authority and Law, Essays in Second Personal Ethics 1, Honor, History and Relationship, Essays in Second Personal Ethics 2. También es muy importante un trabajo que se llama The Second Person Standpoint, publicado en el año 2006, y también podemos destacar libros como Welfare and Rational Care, Philosophical Ethics, The British Moralists and the Internal Out, y el libro Impartial Reason. So, Professor Darwall, for our Faculty of Philosophy is very important for us. It's an actual honor to speak with you. So thanks for accepting our invitation, and please, you could start your presentations. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Darwall. It's an actual honor.
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. That's, I think I got a good bit of that. I wish I could speak to you in Espanol, but you know, I see one of the people on the call is John Frierson, who I was not quite a roommate of in my first year at Yale 58 years ago. At that point, I had much better command of Spanish than I now do, and so I will have to proceed in English. But thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. And let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see what I can see. Everybody can hear me, okay?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, I have to say the Wi-Fi here in Connecticut Hall is an ancient building, and the Wi-Fi is not so good. So I'm hoping we can make it through, but we're asking a lot of the Yale Wi-Fi system. Okay, so the title of this talk is Second Personal Attitudes of the Will and Second Personal Attitudes of the Heart. And I'm starting off with a photo of the great Peter F. Strawson, who wrote many important works in philosophy in the 20th century. But the article that he's known best for, and he's known for several articles in addition to several important books, is titled Freedom and Resentment. So here you see Strawson, sort of insouciantly smoking a cigarette as people did back in those days. And this photo actually was taken by Simon Blackburn, whose name you may know as a very important moral philosopher. So Freedom and Resentment is about the problem of freedom of the will. And he starts off with a classic debate between determinists and people who advocate for freedom of the will. And I won't go through all of the dialectic with you, but pretty early on in the essay, he gets to the idea of what he calls a reactive attitude. Reactive attitudes are very special mental states. And what makes them special is that they're held from what he calls a participant standpoint. They always imply a relationship. It's not just that they imply the fact of relationship, but they are attitudes from within relationship. So they implicitly relate to their objects. They don't simply have intentional objects like all attitudes and emotions. They have implicit addressees. They're implicitly addressed to their object. Don't worry if you don't know if you can't tell what that means yet. I'll try to unpack that a bit. The most famous examples, the examples that people have talked about the most, and there's just been an enormous amount of philosophy, some in action theory, some in moral psychology, some on the problem of freedom of the will, some in fundamental moral philosophy, that's inspired by Strawson's paper. But the attitudes that people tend to focus on are what I'll call the deontic examples. Resentment, from the title. Blame, though Strawson himself doesn't use the word blame, he uses indignation. The idea is that resentment is something we feel from the perspective of a victim. How could you have done that to me? You've wronged me. Notice the you there. That's the idea. So it's felt as if relating to another you. Blame, we feel not as if from the victim's standpoint, but as if from anyone's standpoint, or what I call the standpoint of a representative member of the moral community. Guilt, obviously, we feel from the perspective of a perpetrator, the person who did wrong or violated somebody else's rights, who wronged someone. Now, what's noticed, so a lot of ink has been spilled, I hope productively, over these deontic examples. And that's really what I was writing about in the second person standpoint, and almost exclusively in the other works, Morality, Authority, and Law, and Honor, History, and Relationship, that were mentioned. But there are also these non-deontic examples: gratitude, love, forgiveness, hurt feelings. Those are quotes from Strawson. And it's only relatively recently that scholars have turned their attention to these non-deontic examples. And what I want to go through with you this afternoon is both what's different about the deontic examples and the non-deontic examples, but also what's the same. Because structurally, there's something common to all these examples that makes them reactive attitudes. If we're successful, if we can figure out what these have in common, then we will have done something that Strawson himself never does. That is to say, what it is that makes an attitude a reactive attitude. He gives examples, he says a lot about them, but he doesn't really define them. So that's our sort of modest goal for the afternoon. Okay, So all reactive attitudes, again, just to rehearse this a bit, are held or felt from what Strawson calls a participant stance, as opposed to what he calls an objective stance. Now you can think about this in terms of pronouns. They're felt as if from a second person perspective, where if you were to express your attitude, you'd naturally do it with you, or ustedes, or you all, or in Pittsburgh, yuns, or in Brooklyn, you guys, back in the 50s or whatever it is. So some expression that takes the second person grammatical pronoun, singular or plural, it doesn't matter, as opposed to a third person perspective, he, him, her. Now, just parenthetically, I think it's interesting in this context, as you probably know, there's a lot of contestation, a lot of it on campuses. I don't know if it's also in Colombia, but certainly in the United States, about pronouns, about favored pronouns and gendered pronouns and non-gendered pronouns and so on. That's all about the third person. And there's actually a deep point here, which is when you address someone in the second person, all of that stuff drops away. And you're just relating to the other as the particular individual they are, and you being the particular individual you are, and any characterization of them as you would by saying him or her, just drops away. So the contrast here is between the second person perspective and a third person perspective. And it's a grammatical or logical feature of these attitudes. So second person doesn't necessarily mean another person. You can have one of these attitudes towards yourself, with guilt being the obvious example. It has to do with the implicit element of address, the implicit youing, as it were, that there, ustedes or tú shows up in it. Now, you can have these attitudes without actually saying anything, obviously, or even without having the conscious thought, you. But the thought is that were you to put your attitude into words, you do it in the second person. That's the crucial idea. So that I say that these attitudes implicitly relate to their objects. And so they have not simply objects, but also addressees. Okay, now deontic reactive attitudes mediate mutual accountability. Now, first, what do I mean by deontic? Deontic refers to moral concepts like duty, obligation, right, wrong, rights, wrongs, in the sense of a wrong done to someone, a wronging of someone, permissible, that's another deontic notion. Here's some ethical notions that are not deontic: good, bad, estimable, shameful, contemptible. Those are ethical attitudes in the sense that they have an implicit ethical content to them. They represent their objects as having some kind of ethical normative quality or property, but they're not deontic. They don't say of that person that they are obligated to do something, or that something is their duty, or that they failed in their duty, or that they did their duty, or that they did it culpably. They acted wrongly, culpably. So the main thoughts here is we have these deontic notions. They have to do with, I claim, accountability. So what it is for an act to be wrong is for it to be an act. It's not just that there are good reasons not to do it. It's that it's an act of a kind such that were you to do it without excuse, that would be blameworthy. You'd be rightly subject to blame, not necessarily to somebody coming up and wagging their finger and saying, "No, you really shouldn't have done that," but to blame the attitude, the reactive attitude. So the reactive attitude, philosophers say, would be a fitting response. That's kind of a technical term. It doesn't just mean it would be appropriate. It means it would fit what you did. Okay, so deontic notions are these duty notions. Rights, the notion of rights is also a deontic notion, because you can't have a right to something unless it would be wrong for somebody else not to provide it for you. So the doctrine of natural rights presupposes the doctrine of natural duties and the natural wrongs. That just goes with the territory. It's just a conceptual accompaniment. But what makes all these things deontic, I claim in my work, is this conceptual connection to accountability. So an obligation is what you're rightly held accountable for doing. This is a point that John Stuart Mill makes very nicely in chapter 5 of Utilitarianism, where he says, we don't call an act wrong unless we mean to imply that it's an act of a kind that would be rightly subject to punishment, if not by law, then he says by social opinion, if not by social opinion, then by the deliverances of conscience. Okay, whoops, there goes, the Wi-Fi is still working, but the lights aren't. So that happens in Connecticut Hall from time to time, and I have to go over and just wave my arm. Sorry about that. And there's no way of predicting it. There's no way to change it. It's just going to happen. Okay. So deontic reactive attitudes are essentially interpersonal. That is, they're essentially not just between people, but they're felt in relating to someone in the sense I was talking about. I'll have some examples of this in a second. They implicitly make a demand on the agent. So if somebody blames me for having done something, then they're implicitly demanding that I not have done it, but they're also implicitly demanding that I take responsibility for having done it and acknowledge that I did it and hold myself accountable to them. They also therefore presuppose the legitimacy of those demands. So that they presuppose that the person who makes the demand isn't simply demanding, but they have the authority to do so, that it's a legitimate demand. And they bid for acknowledgement. They, as I put it, they come with an implicit RSVP. So all second personal deontic reactive attitudes presuppose two fundamental things. And this was the role they played in Strawson's argument, because remember, the argument was about freedom of the will. First, they have to presuppose that the other person has what I call second personal competence. That is, that they have a will, that they're capable of forming their will in response to these legitimate demands. So they have to be able to know about them, and they have to be able to comply with them because they're legitimate demands. So that's second personal competence. If you like, all reactive attitudes, hence all obligations, imply that the person to whom the attitude is felt, or the person who has the obligation, is a moral subject with a free will. And with a will that's not just sort of arbitrarily free, that they can do what they want to do, but that they are capable, that they have a conscience. They're capable of forming their will freely in response to a legitimate demand, in response to a moral demand. And it also presupposed what I call second personal authority. That is, that if you blame someone, you're implicitly, you're relating to them with reciprocal recognition or mutual respect, and you are presupposing that they too are in a position to blame you should you do something that was wrong. So here's an example. This is now quite dated. It's from about, I suppose, 12, 13 years ago. And it's at the Winter Olympics in Turin in Italy. And coincidentally, there are two Italian ice dancers. Maurizio Margaglio is the man, and Barbara Fusser-Poli is the woman. And they're in the finals of the ice dancing competition. And they get very, they're doing great. Everything's going well. They're contending for a medal, maybe a bronze, maybe a silver, just maybe a gold. And then Maurizio drops Barbara Fusser-Poli. And they both fall to the ice, and they're on the ice for a while. There's this really awkward silence. And then they get up, and Barbara Fusser-Poli looks at Maurizio, and then she really looks at Maurizio. And so one of the newspapers on the internet that carried this story had as a caption to this photo, Barbara Fusar-Poli to Maurizio Margoglio, look me in the eye and tell me how you dropped me. Here's another GIF that sort of gets you the idea, right? So blame or resentment is an eyes on eyes attitude. What I mean by that, it doesn't simply look at its object, it looks to its object to get the object to look back at it and to acknowledge the wrongdoing and to take responsibility for it. In that way, blame, resentment, these deontic reactive attitudes contrast with contempt. The classic expression of contempt is rolling your eyes. When you think about it, if you roll your eyes, you're precisely taking them out of position to actually look at the other person. So blame is an eyes on eyes attitude. Contempt is also critical, obviously, but it doesn't implicitly address its object. If it addresses anybody, this is like, it addresses what I call the cognoscenti off stage. That is, the people who are in a position to see just how contemptible what this person is doing is. But this person, how contemptible that is. So we can, I won't give her some words here, but you can imagine what she might be saying. Whatever she's saying, it's not in the second person. It's in the third person. What a creep. Well, I gave her words. Well, you get the idea. Okay. There are lots of interesting things about contempt. I've written about contempt. Whereas blame focuses on the individual, contempt characterizes somebody as someone of a kind, a jerk, for example. So it doesn't say you did this and you must take responsibility for it. It says, of course you did, of course he did that. He's just that kind of person. Okay. So by contrast, deontic reactive attitudes like blame and resentment hold their objects accountable. So clearly what Barbara Fusar-Poli is doing is holding Maurizio Margoglio accountable. You might say, well, why? How could you be accountable for for an accident like dropping someone? I suspected she's not seeing that way. I suspect she's saying, okay, you tell me how this happened. Were you not concentrating or whatever? Actually, I put this together a couple of years ago. So before the most recent Winter Olympics, you may remember this really fine, very young Russian skater woman who messes up in her last performance. And she comes over and talks to the Russian coach, who's just completely furious. And he's basically saying, and he says, you could actually hear this, did you take your mind off it? Did you stop concentrating? So the idea is that it holds somebody accountable for something they did, for not exercising their will in the appropriate way, either by intentionally willing something wrong or by negligently failing to will something that they were morally obligated to do. Okay, so unlike contempt, they implicitly address their objects second personally and call on them to hold themselves accountable. Now, it's important for this way of seeing things that reactive attitudes like blame and resentment are not essentially attempting to retaliate or to deliver a cost to the other. There's a quote from Adam Smith that I like very much. There we go. That sounded pretty interesting. Okay, so I going to try to read all this, but I don't know whether what's on your screen is occluded by some of the tiles, but in my case it is. So this is from Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a great work of moral psychology. The object, he says, which resentment is chiefly intent upon, is not so much to make the wrongdoer feel pain in his turn as to make him conscious that he feels it upon account of his past conduct to make him repent of that conduct and to make him sensible that the person whom he injured did not deserve to be treated in that manner. So the thought is that insofar as it's a Straussonian reactive attitude, it's a second personal engagement with the other, demanding that the other hold themselves accountable as an equal moral person. So it's actually an expression of respect, not respect in the sense of esteem, but recognition. It implicitly recognizes the other as an equal moral person. And it's an eyes on eyes, looking at the same level attitude. Contempt looks down on its object. Blame looks to the other on the same level, eyes to eyes. Okay, there we go. So deontic reactive attitudes, then, all presuppose what I'll call a reciprocity of right. That is, equal rights of the person, in principle, of the person with the attitude and the person towards whom the attitude is held, and a mutuality of expectation and accountability, that both parties are accountable to one another and have common expectations. Now, by contrast, what I'm calling the non-deontic reactive attitudes don't presuppose mutual expectations. They're not about expecting things of others. Rather, they involve a heartfelt expression to another heart that invites reciprocation. So the idea is that they're also reciprocating attitudes, but it's not expressing a demand or an expectation to another will that's capable of recognizing the legitimacy of that expectation. It's rather an opening of one's heart to another in the hope, not in the expectation, that the other will receive that, will take that into their heart, and thereby open their hearts to one in return. So both attitudes involve an invitation of reciprocation. They both involve what I call an RSVP, respondez-vous s'il vous plaît. But in the one case, it's demanded. In the other case, it's invited and hoped for. So an interesting way of seeing this is to note a distinction between guilt and remorse. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the words would be in Spanish for this. And I'm not sure everybody who uses these words in English observes this distinction. That doesn't really matter. The point is that there are two different attitudes that we can identify as a matter of our psychology. So guilt involves an acknowledgement of culpable wrongdoing. It's deontic. It involves an acknowledgement of responsibility for injury, where injury is not just a harm, but injury is the legal moral notion of something that's rightly a subject of a tort. So guilt often involves a tortfeasor feeling that the other person was harmed or injured, and so there's some compensation for that that's required. And if it's not a matter of injuring someone in particular, but it's just a matter of a wrong, still the guilt involves the implicit expression of responsibility and some kind of taking responsibility with respect to people as members of the moral community, and to oneself, of course, as a member of the moral community as well. Remorse adds to that sorrow for the pain or suffering that one has culpably caused, where sorrow, the OED says, is mental distress caused by loss, deep sadness, grief. Now, these are different attitudes. You can feel guilt without feeling remorse in this sense of remorse. Okay. And the crucial thing is that remorse is a heartfelt response. You feel heartsick. So there's a very good example of this. I learned this from Liz Anderson, who told me about, I forget the guy's name at the moment, but this man who works for the University of Michigan hospitals. And his job is to deal with messes that, malpractice cases and so on. So let's say a doctor kills a patient inadvertently, but arguably negligently. Now, this guy's job is to, let's just stipulate that his job is to make sure that the hospitals are lose as little money as possible in the case, right? So in the bad old days, the person doing that job would go to the lawyers. We'll imagine that there's some fancy law firm that the University of Michigan hospitals employ. And then the lawyers' representatives go to the victim's family and say, look, you could contest this. Of course, you could try this case. You could bring a tort action, try to get legal compensation for it. But let me tell you, we got a lot of lawyers, and they're very highly paid lawyers, and it's going to, and we will contest it. We'll fight it all the way, and it'll take you months or years. And at the end of the day, you may not get anything. However, maybe we can make a deal. And so they offer some kind of deal as compensation. And that's the way it would have operated in the past. This guy operates an entirely different way. He says to the doctors, look, you feel awful about this, right? And of course, they do feel awful about it. And they feel not just that they, let's suppose it was a case of negligence. They feel guilt about that. They also feel sick in their hearts. They feel grief about the person who's passed and that they caused that person's passing. So suppose that's true. It almost always is true, by the way. And he says, look, here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to go with me to the family, the victim's family, if they're willing to talk to you. Maybe they won't be. But if they are, and often they are, actually, then you're going to need to come clean. And you're going to need to not just acknowledge that you did something wrong and that you wronged this person, but you're going to have to feel, I see you now. You can imagine him saying, I see you now. You feel awful about this. You have to share that with them. You've got to share with them how sick you are about what you've done. And often what happens is that the conversation gets very emotional on both sides, and everybody ends hugging each other with tears flowing. So the point here is that in many situations where people are done wrong and suffer because of it, there's the problem of justice in first, which is the deontic problem. What's the appropriate just response to compensate this person for their injury? But there's also the problem of healing them. And no tort settlement in itself can heal the emotional feelings, the heart sickness that the victim or the victim's family has. So guilt is a deontic thing, and it's the sense that one's violated a justified demand. It's an attitude of the will. It's focused on what one did and on taking responsibility for that by setting one's will to resolve to do differently in the future. But remorse adds to that sorrow or sadness for the pain and suffering that one has caused. It involves a heartfelt care or concern for the injured person. So it opens the heart to the heart of the injured person or the people who are, their family or whatever it is, in the hope that they will receive that. Can't expect anything about that. They may not, and that'll hurt even more, and they'll hurt. But the only way it can be resolved or healed is through some kind of heart-to-heart relation. So remorse, I say, is an attitude of the heart. So just as deontic attitudes of the will, the reactive attitudes of resentment and blame and guilt, mediate mutual accountability, that is the mutual responsibility of equal moral free wills to one another, so attitudes of the heart mediate heartfelt relating. They mediate personal relationship, where what we share is our hearts, where we, the way we care, not just the fact that we care, but share our feelings with one another by holding one another, beholding one another, and upholding one another. It's an interesting thing that philosophers have written a lot about friendship and love over the last 20 years. Didn't write so much before then, or maybe 30, or maybe it's even 40 years now. But most of what people write about has nothing to do with feeling. It has to do with joint commitments, being committed to one another, living your lives together in the sense that you deliberate from a shared point of view, wanting to spend time with one another, and so forth and so on. That's all important. Of course, it's important. But I take it that the heartfelt stuff is also important, wanting to share one's heart with a beloved or a friend. And so that involves necessarily non-deontic, second personal attitudes of the heart. So both deontic and non-deontic reactive attitudes call for response. They both come with an RSVP. But whereas deontic reactive attitudes expect response, the non-deontic ones invite it without expectation. They open the heart to another heart. So the response that deontic attitudes expect is respect, reciprocal respect for a legitimate expectation. The response that non-deontic attitudes of the heart invite is a reciprocal attitude of the heart. Now, there's some interesting points here. So this is why I think there could not be a justified expectation or an obligation to have an attitude of the heart like love or remorse. So we can be obligated to take care and not be negligent with another person's heart, but we can't be obligated to have the attitude of the heart itself. Why? Because anything you can be obligated to do, you can be moved to do out of respect for the legitimate demand that the obligation involves. So the most that an obligation to feel love could give you is respect for the demand that you feel love, but that couldn't make you feel love. There's always a gap. So the non-deontic second personal attitudes of the heart don't involve respect per se, they involve love. So the two fundamental motivations, I think, moral motivations, ethical motivations, are just those: love on the one hand and respect on the other. And those map onto the difference between the non-deontic reactive attitudes, the attitudes of the heart, and the deontic reactive attitudes of the will. Okay. So what do I mean by heart? Philosophers don't write about the heart, I think, and part of it is because, well, part of it is because as philosophers, we tend to be in our heads more than with our hearts. I mean, even now, I'm giving you a philosophical lecture or talk about the heart, but that's not itself heartfelt. So by definition, philosophers are doing head stuff. they're not working with their hearts. Doesn't mean philosophers don't have hearts. We do. But we're pretty good at disguising that from ourselves and not really relating to people on that level. What do I mean by heart? I just mean nothing. It's a metaphor, obviously. It turns out it's a metaphor that goes way, way back, certainly as far as the Greeks. I just mean this complicated syndrome combination of emotional susceptibilities, the emotional vulnerability to sadness, joy, and grief, all of which are part of what we might call caring for someone or loving them. So there are emotions which we can be said to say, and we do say, are felt in our hearts or in a heartfelt way. So these statistics are way out of date, but I assure you that if you were to do the same thing today, you'd get something in roughly the same proportions. So these are just Google searches for the phrase heartfelt love, heartfelt grief, heartfelt appreciation, and so on. And then heartfelt indignation, heartfelt resentment, heartfelt guilt. Obviously, an enormous difference. So even though we don't really have this theory in our heads, it really affects the way we use language. We just don't tend to say that indignation. We do tend to say that remorse is heartfelt. So there's a little bit of empirical evidence, not for a philosophical conclusion, but for the fact that we are implicitly thinking with these distinctions. Now, there's an important caveat that I have to make. That is that even though it's true, I think, that attitudes like love and gratitude don't themselves presuppose obligations or expectations, these may nonetheless be aspects of relationships that these attitudes help to structure. That is, the obligations can be an aspect of that. So let's suppose, for example, that friends who care about one another have an obligation to be careful with their caring for one another. And of course, there are all kinds of other obligations that, say, partners take on when they go into particular relationships, particular personal relationships, whether they're marriages or other kinds of committed relationships. So there's just a difference between an obligation to take due care. That doesn't mean to feel care. That means to be careful in how one, and that's a matter of the will, how one conducts oneself with respect to one's love. So I think there's I forget exactly who the singer is who sings this song entitled, "I'll Take Good Care of Your Heart." That just makes the point. The heart itself is involuntary. It's not something that one feels by intending to do so. On the other hand, you can be careful voluntarily. And if you're not careful, then you may have an obligation to be careful. Okay, now I'm just gonna, this is something that I've been writing about in various ways. And so I just want to make you aware of some of these writings and just to very quickly say a little bit about what I say in these various articles. So the things I've written about are love and gratitude and trust, but also what it is to be with somebody in a shared space of second personal, heartfelt relating. So love is perhaps the best example. In fact, you could argue, I think I would argue, that love is, as it were, the central second personal attitude of the heart, so that all other ones like gratitude, for example, and trust, hurt feelings is another one, presuppose love in the background. They're aspects of love. So love, I say, as in the title, it's reciprocal holding, beholding, and upholding. The idea is that love wishes or implicitly invites its object to be together in one another's presence a second's personal space of heartfelt relating, of effective emotional sharing. Now, obviously, they're very different kinds of loving relations. They're friendships, for example, of people. I'll just give you an example. I have a very close friendship with a man who he's not really, neither of us are very good at, nor do we express loving, careful concern for one another sort of explicitly. But we spend a lot of time together, and I think it's manifest to both of us that we care a lot about one another. But we do want to be in one another's presence, and it's a presence of heartfelt relating, even if it's not sort of gushing, lots of hugs and things like that. Still, it's plainly heartfelt. So there's an article I have also called Being With, where the topic is, well, what is it to be with another person? It's a very interesting topic. It means not just being in the same space, geographical space. It means being in the other's presence, where presence is always implicitly second personal. I can be present to you only if you're present to me. We have to be mutually present, and being present to one another is in this way second personal. It's reciprocal. There are forms of presence that aren't heartfelt. If you're brought into the king's presence, let's say, so that the king can give you a boon or whatever it is that kings do, that needn't be heartfelt, but it's got to be the second personal thing. But the things, the being with that we care about in personal relationship is heartfelt, I think. Another paper is on gratitude as a second personal attitude of the heart. And I want to pause over this a bit because it brings out some of the points, I think, in a particularly interesting way. So my theory is that gratitude is an attitude of heartfelt appreciation and thankfulness to a perhaps presupposed benefactor. The reason I have the perhaps presupposed thing is, when we feel gratitude for a beautiful day, as we had earlier today in New Haven, you might think, well, who exactly is that gratitude felt towards, or who is or thanks given to? You can do it theologically, say, well, thanks be to God, but it might be just that the benefactor is in some way just presupposed by the attitude, even if it's not realized. So in this paper, I contrast that view with two other historical views, one from Kant. Kant writes that gratitude consists in honoring a person because of a benefit he has rendered us. The feeling connected with this judgment is respect for the benefactor. Now, this kind of respect is not recognition, it's what I call appraisal respect or esteem, admiration, if you like, who puts one under obligation, whereas the benefactor is viewed only in relation of love towards the recipient. So the idea is someone, just out of the goodness of their heart, gives you something, and that puts you under obligation to them. You owe them gratitude. And the motive of action will then be respect for the benefactor. Okay. Another view, quite different, but I want to end up criticizing both of these views, is Adam Smith's. And this view is actually, this passage is just wonderfully, parallel to the passage I read earlier about resentment. What gratitude is chiefly intent upon, you may recall what our resentment is chiefly intent upon. Okay, so in this case, what gratitude is chiefly intent upon is not only to make the benefactor feel pleasure in his turn, but to make him feel pleased with that conduct, and to satisfy him that the person upon whom he bestowed his good offices was not unworthy of them. So you want the other person to feel to feel pleasure with himself for having provided a benefit to someone who it was not inappropriate to, someone who didn't quite deserve it. It came out of the goodness of that person's heart, but nonetheless, it was appropriate. Now, one way of sort of testing these theories, and at the same time to test the theory I'm putting forward, is to note this really interesting psychological finding that there's just a remarkable connection between gratitude and what psychologists call subjective well-being or happiness. And the point is that if people feel gratitude more, then they're going to be happier. And this is a matter of sort of common knowledge, I suppose. Now, people have gratitude diaries where they're advised to write down things that they're grateful for, and they feel better because of that. Now, ask yourself whether Kant's theory would explain something like that. Kant's theory is that when you feel gratitude, you're feeling a sense of obligation to someone else who puts you under obligation by benefiting you. Doesn't feel like something that would really make you really happy. Oh my God, there's something else I got to do. Or with Adam Smith, it's something like a kind of admiration for the other. And maybe it's a mutual admiration thing. You admire me, I admire you. But that just seems different from the way in which gratitude makes us happy. On the other hand, if gratitude is, as I say, a second personal attitudes of the heart, then it engages the heart in a heartfelt way, and it mediates a heartfelt relationship. And of course, we know that one of the things that's most important to human beings is their relationships of the heart, their personal relationships with others, whether it's family or even colleagues or friends, or people in battle get connected in these deep, heartfelt ways. Then finally, I have a paper on trust. And what makes trust, first, there's the idea that trust is second personal. Well, that's pretty much the common view, I think, in the field. So Annette Beyer, Richard Holton, Karen Jones, many people have written about trust. They note first that trust is different from reliance. You can't rely on the lights in or the Wi-Fi, let's say, in Connecticut Hall. But I imagine there's some place where you can rely on these things. Okay, but trust is different from reliance. Trust is got to be another person and a being who's capable of second personal engagement. And it's from a second person standpoint. So trust is the sort of thing that can be betrayed, for example. And you can't just trust someone irrespective of whether they want you to trust them. If you say to somebody, I'm trusting you to do this, and it's a stranger, they're going to say, what do you mean? You're trusting me to do this. What gives you the standing to trust me? So trust is always about within some kind of implied relationship. And I think also trust involves, it's not a deontic attitude. And I think there is also a kind of implied RSVP. If I trust you, I'm inviting you to trust in my trust, and maybe also to trust me in other ways as well. Okay, so this is a table that sort of brings all these points together. On the left side, we have different attitudes, the deontic ones and the attitudes of the heart. And then we have on the top, the mode of awaiting response, the response to fulfillment, and the response to frustration. So with the deontic cases, you expect response. If they fulfill it, okay, great, they did their duty. It's not, they don't get praise for doing their duty. They just did what they were obligated to do. On the other hand, if they don't do it, that's where the deontic reactive attitudes come into play. Okay, blame, resentment, guilt. So those are all towards violations. With attitudes of the heart, there is no expectation when you're awaiting the response. You invite the response and you hope. Hope, by the way, is itself another second personal attitude of the heart. The response to fulfillment is joy or gladness, another second personal attitude of the heart. The response to frustration is not anger. I mean, it can be. Actually, personal anger is a really interesting case. I mean, not indignation or blame, but I just mean anger. And it can be quite angering. But there, it's because of the hurt feelings. And the hurt feelings, you try to protect yourself against the hurt by feeling anger. And the anger is trying to get the other person to attend to how much this means to you. And with the hope, perhaps, that, okay, they didn't really know what they were doing, and they do care. But the proper response, or the response that's sort of most indicative of an attitude of the heart like love, when it's not returned, is sadness or hurt feelings. Okay. So just then, to sum up, all reactive attitudes call for reciprocation. They all come with an RSVP. Deontic reactive attitudes, resentment, blame, guilt, expect respect. They're will-to-will attitudes, and they expect their attitude in response to what we take to be disrespect, but their respectful demand for respect. Attitudes of the heart, on the other hand, invite reciprocating heartfelt attitudes. They open the heart of the person with the attitude to the other, and in particular to their heart, hoping that the other person will open their heart to them and at least receive the love and perhaps return it in return. So with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention. I'm very eager to hear what reactions you might have or questions you might have. And thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing here. Okay.
Thanks, Professor Darwall, for your exciting presentation. For me, it's a very interesting way to understand the debate about the second person perspective. I was thinking when I was hearing you that the way that we can understand the second person attitudes is a good way to understand the second person perspective as a whole. Because sometimes when we think on second person perspective, maybe we're thinking in different issues. So for me, your presentation was very clear, very exciting. And thanks, Professor Darwall, for your presentation. So we have a few minutes for questions, for a little bit of conversation. So you can ask your questions in the chat, or you could also raise your hand in the Zoom. And even if you are seeing this presentation in YouTube, you could make a comment and we can read it. So I'm gonna read a commentary by Andrea. I deeply appreciate the turn to emotion to think love as presented here. It finds good company with effective neuroscience such as Damasio and Panksepp, going back to Spinoza's psychology, linking love to emotion and to homeostasis. Does justice to both philosophy and science. Thanks, Andrea, for your comment. And I don't know if anyone wants to make a comment, maybe a question. You could make it in the chat, or you could raise your hand here in the application. Juan, if you want to take your word, you could do it right now. Juan Piñeros.
Are you there, Juan?
Juan, go ahead.
Actually, while we're waiting for Juan, maybe I could just respond a little bit to the point about Damasio.
Maybe let me.
Oh, he says he
Okay,
can't.
I can unmute now, but Steve,
There you
please.
go. He's there. Good.
Awesome.
Oh, it just went. You just went mute again.
You're mute again, Juan.
Sorry, I was saying that that you should make your point about Damasio, Steve, first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just about Damasio. So that's a great point. I once gave a talk about Hume and Adam Smith and their sort of sentimentalist approach to moral thought, and brought in Damasio. Yeah, and it's a very, yeah. I think we need both. We both need the feeling side of it, but we also need the reasoning side of it. Yeah. So
okay, so Steve, I know we've talked about some of these topics before, but there's a topic that I don't think I've ever asked about before. So I don't know if you've thought about. So I think Strawson briefly mentions how children are kind of brought up into the practice of these reactive attitudes.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that it's kind of an interesting dynamic in how children might be incorporated, sounds like, to like a manufacturing process. It's more like they're invited into a practice. And it seems as though when children are being brought up, so there's a kind of interesting dynamic, the kind of RSVPs that we send. So we can sometimes blame children where they don't do what they're supposed to do, it seems like. Yet, insofar as they have not yet fully developed their wills, I think that you can do this even with a 4 or 5 year old. You can, it seems, at most hope that they will understand this. You cannot have the expectation that they will in the way in which you cannot expect it of fully mature person.
Yeah.
At the same time, kind of, and so, and I don't know if maybe teaching itself is going to be an action that's going to fall under second personal action of the heart. So it seems, I don't know. So the kind of broader question is, in the context of educating children into a practice of second personal attitudes, how do these two interact?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I also noticed that in the chat, Joanna asked more broadly about education. So let me first start with your question, Juan, and focus it on, let's say, the parent-child thing, or the caretaker, let's just put it that way, child relation. And then there's a more general question about education. I mean, the first one's about education too, but there's a broader question about education as well that we can talk about later. So many things to say here. First, I think it's just an axiom that even if part of what are we trying to do as parents? We're trying to, there goes the lights again. Can't rely on the lights. Okay. Part of what we're trying to do is to induct our kids into the moral community, as it were, in the deontic moral community, so that they can become their own people, their own persons. They can become individuals with autonomy rights that they simply don't have when they're very young, that they can hold themselves and be held responsible for their actions, that they become what Locke describes as being capable of a law, being capable of being a subject of morality, or even a subject of law for that matter. So that's on the deontic side. And so one question is, well, how do you do that? But there's also the case that it's important in the parental relationship that there's always the context of love. Because the first thing that the kids need is to feel love. They need to feel emotionally safe. And they only can feel that way if there's a lack of defensiveness and there's a lack of direction. There's got to be a background of love as well. So these things have to go together in a way. And if you try to do it completely without love, then you're going to get a weird result. I think theoretically it's possible. You can imagine beings who have second personal competence, but are incapable of love. I take it Spock, let's say, in Star Trek is supposed to be such a being. Okay, but now let me try to more directly answer the question. So how do we make someone into, or how do we draw out of them their moral subjecthood? Well, the good news is that they're hard. I think this is true. Michael Tomasello has some really interesting evolutionary theorizing about the disposition to cooperate and the disposition to hold oneself to obligations of fairness. And it turns out that young kids, pretty much regardless of culture, at the age of 3, tend to acquire, they don't always acquire, but they tend to acquire this capacity. If you Google Tomasello children experiments, there's some really quite amazing experiments you can see videos of on the web. So we're hardwired, Tomasello thinks, to acquire a sense of what he himself calls second personal morality. So the basic psychological machinery that second personal competence requires, empathy, not in the sense of feeling for the other person, not sympathetic concern, but rather the capacity to put yourself into the other person's perspective, see yourself from their perspective and them from your perspective at the same time, and then regulate that by some kind of perspective that's impartial as between the two, take up an impartial second personal perspective. Tomasello says that's hardwired. And his speculation is that it came about because our gatherer ancestors eons ago had to engage in what he calls obligate collaborative foraging. That is, it's much more difficult to forage by yourself. It's much easier to forage in groups of 2. Once you get 3, then it's more problematic. So there were these groups of 2. This is all his theory. So then there was the capacity for perspective taking, a certain kind of empathy, not necessarily emotional contagion, was selected for. So if that's true, that's some good news. Now, there's other evidence for it, and the other evidence has to do with he's done a lot of research with other apes, other primates, and they don't show this. They can be strategically rational in various ways, and they can cooperate in the sense that they can play iterated prisoner's dilemma, and they do the cooperative thing, but they don't do it for the cooperative reason. So there's this really interesting research that was claiming to show that Capuchin monkeys had a sense of justice and fairness. It may be worth just saying a little bit about this because it's quite illuminating. There are these Capuchin monkeys. They had been the trainer had been reinforcing certain kinds of conduct with bananas. They do the conduct, they get the banana. 2 monkeys side by side, different cages. Then one day, the trainer comes in, both monkeys do the task, and one monkey gets the banana and the other monkey gets a carrot. And you're smiling, so you know the result, right? So the other monkey who got the carrot basically says, what am I, chopped liver, and throws the carrot. Even though it's true that the monkey would have preferred to have a carrot to not having a carrot. Okay, and so the people running the experiment said, these monkeys have a sense of fairness. Well, I remember this being presented at Yale, actually, and Josh Knobe was responding. And he said, you know, I'm not sure this is a sense of fairness. Did the other monkey complain that the monkey who got the carrot just got a carrot? That would be fairness, right? Because in the one case, it's just wanting to get something for yourself. In the other case, it's the sense that, oh, they were entitled to the same thing. So, you know, the famous saying from Abraham Lincoln, as I would not be a slave, so I will not be a slave owner. That's fairness reasoning. That's categorical imperative reasoning. That's moral reasoning. And it seems like there's that much you don't have to teach your kids. That's kind of there. And of course, you can't simply rely on that. You've got to reinforce it. You've got to hold them accountable. Now, here's where your question comes. This is where Bernard Williams's idea of prolepsis comes in. What you do is you don't just give them carte blanche. You sort of hold them accountable in the sense of, you say, no, we don't do this. This is the wrong thing to do. You need to know that you shouldn't do this. And, you know, give an account of yourself. Why did you do it? So forth and so on. But we don't hold them fully responsible. So we're always, you know, we have to realize that they're not persons, full persons, in the sense of subject to obligations fully. And so we step back and we just work on these two tracks. So we treat them as if subjects to some extent, but then when we see this is going nowhere, then we step back and we love them some more, and, you know, we express, you know, so it's a combination of these things, I think.
Thanks, Professor Darwall. I think we have another question. Guillermo Acevedo, go ahead.
Well, first, Professor Darwall, I would like to thank you for your conference. It was amazing. And I would like to ask you a question about a comment that you made in the very beginning of your conference that has to do with the implications, the deep implication that has this distinction when you talk about gender discussions, when you talk about the second and the third person. And I would like to know if you have given it any thought, because to me, it has deep social implications in this discussion. So yeah, that's the question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you a lot, Guillermo. Then I have thought about it, and I've written a couple of things about it. One is a paper on contempt, and another is a paper that I've just written called The Wages of Contempt. So I was suggesting before that contempt is a third personal attitude. You look down on someone, not as that individual, but as exemplifying a contemptible kind. You know, so if it's, let's say it's white supremacy, then it's white contempt for Blacks. If it's male privilege or patriarchy, or more like what Robin Dembroff calls real men on top, then it's contempt both for women, but also for men who are not real men, wimps, losers. Okay. And I think, so what is social status? You can order society by relative power, by relative wealth, or relative goods, or relative status, or also relative authority, like legal rights and so on. The one I think that's often most like social status. But what is social status? Social status is being treated or seen as having a certain status. So what's gender? Well, so this is all about self-presentation and whether other people receive your presentation. You know, the objection, you know, I go back to where we used to think that there was a gender neutral pronoun, he. And then in the 70s, and certainly in the 80s, that came under a lot of criticism from feminists and, fellow travelers. And that's almost never used now, the so-called gender neutral he. But there are people who say, no, we need to do more. So we're going to use they and them. But then there are also people who say, look, I want to be addressed as, or discussed. It's not addressed, because that's the crucial point. I want to be talked about as a they and not as a she and not as a her. Okay, that's the third personal thing. Now, why? Well, what is patriarchy? Patriarchy, by definition, is a hierarchy. And I think it's mostly a social hierarchy. People being treated as above or below. But above and below in what sense? I think the idea is something like they're treated as though they're entitled to or deserving of better treatment, or they're entitled to, or they're actually not entitled to, they're deserving of being looked down upon. And they should look down upon themselves. They should feel shame. Shame is the response to contempt, just as guilt is the response to blame. So I completely agree with you that, all of this contestation is about, at least in the case of pronouns, is about patriarchy. And where patriarchy is seen as a hierarchy of statuses, where to have the status is to be treated as though you deserve to have the status. It's not that you do deserve to have the status. People don't even just say you deserve it. It's just it's implied in the treatment. So you're either honored or you're treated with contempt. And yeah, so this other paper I was talking about, the wages of contempt, is about the costs to society in terms of the kind of political divisions that we now have, the lack of a public space where we can address one another as equals on political matters, but also the individual costs. In the United States, there's this phenomenon of what people call the deaths of despair. You may not know this, but in the United States, there's actually declining life expectancy of all groups together in the last 2 years. Maybe the only country in the so-called developed world where that's true. But some of that recently is the pandemic. And actually a lot of it has to do with some of it has to do with the effects on Native Americans of the pandemic in particular. But the earlier phenomenon that was called the deaths of despair by two economists / sociologists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, have to do with this. These are white, working class, usually men who have been déclassés. They used to have positions of some pride and honor as breadwinners. They had good jobs, let's say, in the industrial north or in the industrial south, working in the steel mill or in the auto plant or whatever it was. And then a lot of those jobs went away. And so those people lost those jobs, and they haven't really gotten jobs that were anything like that. And then, the other thing that happens is, thank God, the women's movement and the resistance to patriarchy, and so their position as the man of the house, that goes away. And they feel shame. They feel like they don't have the place that they had. And it's worse even than that in the United States, because we believe that people deserve their luck. I don't believe that. But a lot of that is the sort of popular ethos that each person is responsible for what they get. And so then they don't only just feel shame, they also feel guilt. And there's a sort of toxic combination of guilt and shame, and it leads to all kinds of dysfunction. It leads to opioid abuse, it leads to alcohol abuse, it leads to tobacco abuse, it leads to suicides. And so you can just actually calculate the deaths of despair. And so people, you know, the people in this group especially, their life expectancy plummeted over the last 10 years or so. So yeah, it's very important, I think. I probably gave you more than you are asking for, but sorry.
That's great. That's fine. That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Darwall again. Mario David Fernandez, he asked a question in the chat. He said, "Thank you so much for your talk today and for your work. I want to ask if you have reference or if you know of any cross-cultural studies that support this distinction between deontic attitudes and attitudes of the heart."
Well, I wish I did. I think the truth is that a lot of psychological studies, psychologists tend not to make a lot of distinctions. So psychologists will talk about pro-social motivation, and they don't even distinguish between fairness motivation and benevolence motivation. Two fundamentally different motives. So if you're benevolent, what you're focused on is trying to advance people's welfare. And you know, you care about them for their own sake, and you want their well-being. Deontic moral notions don't even come in to that. Fairness, on the other hand, is a deontic moral idea. So a sense of fairness is necessarily a sense of the obligation of fairness. Psychologists simply don't, you know, rarely make those distinctions. Sometimes they do. It's not, I'm not indicting the entire field, but and then I don't know anybody who's sort of, I mean, I'm obviously I'm referring to all kinds of psychological stuff that I think supports this, like, for example, the stuff about gratitude and well-being. I don't know about whether any of that is cross-cultural. It's a great question. But, you know, talk to your psychologist friends and let's get the word out.
Thanks, Professor Darwall. Santiago, go ahead, please.
Hello, Steve. It's great to see you again. I just have...
I can't see you, Santiago.
I cannot put my camera on. I probably have to be unlocked by the...
That's cool.
By the host. If you can, Alejandro, thank you. So it's great to see you again, Steve. Thank you so much. I just had a clarificatory question, and it's about the place for responsibility in regards to non-deontic attitudes. Like, I get that in deontic attitudes, when you fail to live up to the obligation, the RSVP comes as a sort of responsibility that is attributable to the agent. But when you turn that obligation to expectation, like, what's the link here? Is there no responsibility? It cannot be attributable to the agent, or how do you make sense of that RSVP there?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So just insofar as the attitudes of love, gratitude, trust, remorse, and so on, just insofar as they are attitudes of the heart, then responsibility simply doesn't enter. Of course, it's a responsible person that you have these attitudes towards. And so you may think that that they have some, so whether our hearts, look, even if it's true that the response itself is non-voluntary, there are all kinds of things we can do voluntarily to put ourselves in a position for our hearts to be open. So oftentimes they're not open because we're defending ourselves in all kinds of ways. Maybe we're defending because we're imagining, we're defending against accusations of different kinds. Or more frequently, I think what's going on is that we're involved in one of these characterizations of others and of ourselves. So both Iris Murdoch and a Danish theologian, philosopher of the 1960s, Knud Ehler Løgstrup, make a distinction between love which Lokstrup in particular argues is second personal. Murdoch says less about that, though I think she'd be committed to it in the end. On the one hand, and what Murdoch calls self-consoling fantasies. And the idea is, imagine two people who are trying to relate to one another. If one of them has going on in their head a narrative about the relationship, there's a kind of story of the relationship, and they're sort of seeing you as a character in that story, then that impedes genuine interaction. By the same token, if you can genuinely interact, then the characterization goes away in the moment. It's not that you might come back, the moment you stop talking to each other. So the point, I think, is that even though we can't control the feeling itself, it wouldn't be the feeling if we could control it, right? We can do a lot about the circumstances in which we are. So we may be defensive. So we try to, breathe, step back, don't take it so personally, And I think one thing that's often really helpful is being mindful of the fact that the other person is just a flawed, wounded person as much as one is. So one's feelings are hurt, okay? Usually that'll be because, that can often be because the other person said something wounding. But why did they say that? Not out of a position of strength. It'll be because they felt wounded as well. And that's all stuff you can do things about. There's couples therapy, for example, or there's all kinds of other therapies that aren't couples, family therapy and so on. A lot of that is just trying to get people to disarm defensiveness. And when defensiveness is disarmed, then we naturally feel these things. The greatest example is with kids, right? You see a baby, anybody sees a baby, and love just springs forth. And I think the reason is that there can't be any defensiveness in relation to the baby. The baby can't possibly accuse you of anything. So there's nothing to defend yourself against, and that disarms the defensiveness, and then the love takes over. The same thing, there's some interesting research that I actually have in a footnote in the second person standpoint about how people are most at ease when they're with their pets. They're more at ease than they are with their spouses, for example. And you do this with blood pressure readings. And the thing about the pet is, of course, the pet is just, you can't, sometimes your cat can look at you in a way that, sort of is something like a charge. But in general, they don't.
Thanks, Professor Darwall. Our professor, Juan Samuel Santos, has a question also. He said, thanks a lot for the wonderful talk. And he asked, have you talked about how your theory on the attitudes of the heart can be used to explain the formation and strength of fundamentalist, radical, fanatical movements? Yeah. I feel that the ties that heartfelt relations form can be stronger than the responsibility, duty mediated relations.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so in this paper, I was alluding to the wages of contempt. I talk a lot about the Trump phenomenon, but not just the Trump phenomenon. I talk about, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's being seen as a response to contempt, the West's contempt. Similarly with, China, a lot of Chinese nationalism has to do with having felt the contempt of the West for centuries. So in the Trump case in particular, this is complicated. People support Trump for all different kinds of reasons, but certainly a very important phenomenon is the sort of army of the people of this sort of group of predominantly white male former workers. It's not by heart. I mean, anyway, it's a lot of it is sort of inflamed. It's a response to imagined contempt from a liberal elite that often does look down their noses. I mean, you'll remember Hillary Clinton's badly chosen remark, "A basket full of deplorables." So part of it is, or like any football coach, who's, I don't know if it is true in what you call football. It's certainly true in what we call football, but I bet it's true in what you call football also, that the thing that motivates players the most is the sense that the other team doesn't respect them, that they look down on them and don't take them seriously. Okay, so that's, now, I haven't talked at all about love yet, but I think one of the things that happens is that people find in these groups something like love, a kind of acceptance, despite the fact that these other people look down on them. So now I'm with my people, and my people accept me, and they want to be with me, and we have good times together. Okay, that's now we're in the love area. They want to be with me. They want to share good feelings, the joy of seeing liberals squirm, and so on. So yeah, I think that matters of the heart do have a kind of a role in group formation, and maybe especially in extremist group formation, where the whole idea is that they're extreme. Everybody else sees them as extreme, as beyond the pale, as outside, as not to be in our group. So then here's a group where I am inside. I'm inside the group that's outside. And that feeling of bonding is a kind of love.
Thanks, Professor Darwall, for your answers. I don't know if anyone has another question or a commentary. Well, Professor Darwall, the conversation was awesome. I was very excited hearing you, and I want to ask you, for you, Professor Darwall, but especially for the rest of the participants in this Zoom, that we could, in a few seconds, turn on your cameras for a snapshot that Shadai will take in a few moments. And por las personas que están en Bogotá, les recordamos también que mañana vamos a tener una conversación con la profesora Patricia Brunstein a las 4 de la tarde en el auditorio Marino Troncoso. También será transmitida por los canales de las redes sociales de nuestra facultad. So I want to remind you, tomorrow we'll begin the colloquium on intersubjectivity and second person. And our keynote speaker for tomorrow will be the Professor Patricia Bronstein for the National University of Córdoba, Argentina. She will talk with us at the 4 p.m. In Bogotá. That presentation will be in the Auditorio Marino Troncoso in our University Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Shadai, creo que ya todos tenemos la cámara prendida.
I should also say just one thing. I see now that Kate Abramson is revealed to us, though her name was there before, but she's also done some very important work on the second personal character of love. So yeah, just
great.
Like all allies here.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
My cat was protesting, so I couldn't have the camera on.
Cats will do that, right?
Listo, ready? It's done.
Gracias, Shai. And Professor, Abramson, maybe in a few weeks or months, we could contact you for a new conversation, this time with you, if you agree with us, of course. So thank you very much, Professor Darwall. We are very glad for your presentation, for the conversation, for everything. And it's the best way to begin with our activities in this second colloquium on intersubjectivity and the second person. Tomorrow we will be here in Pontificia Universidad Javeriana talking about a lot of issues, especially on second person perspective, on responsibility, on mental attribution. And I remind you, tomorrow our keynote speaker will be Professor Patricia Bronstein. She will talk about empathy. So Professor Darwall, thank you very much, and thanks for everyone for to be here in this presentation. Thanks again, and I expect we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.